Robert Weissman, co-president of the nonprofit advocacy organization Public Citizen. Robert, welcome to the program.
It's great to be with you.
I just want to start with it's a very general question before we get into some of the suits that you've brought. Tell us just a little bit about Public Citizen. What do you guys normally do?
Yeah, when we're not confronting an unprecedented authoritarian threat.
That's basically what I meant.
Yeah, in those times, we're in the business of trying to take on corporate power in Washington, D.C. We were founded more than 50 years ago by Ralph Nader. We have a really broad portfolio. We work on everything from global trade to drug prices to consumer financial protection to campaign finance. We litigate, we advocate at specialized agencies like the FDA. We do on-the-ground organizing and more. And we've always been really fundamentally concerned, along with corporate power, with the functioning of a democracy. And that's a different thing now than it was a few months ago.
Yeah, I spend every year, usually twice a year, but sometimes once a year, I go to a tort conference, a mass tort conference, and interview a lot of litigators who fight corporate power in many instances, and as a public, and there is public interest firms that come in, not-for-profits, and will take cases that aren't profitable for some of these lawyers to take. Where do you fit in that niche of? I know that you're more oriented towards what government is doing, and but where do you fit into that niche? There's a hole there, isn't there?
Yeah, well, what you're describing are cases that are usually brought by consumers, sometimes employees, against large corporations for dangerous products, or maybe sometimes for an environmental toxin. They can either bring cases on their own, or in these big cases that you're describing, come together either in class actions or things that are called mass actions. And there's a whole trial bar that specializes in bringing those cases. We don't bring those cases at the trial level, which is where you have to amass all the evidence and you're going back and forth about what exactly happened. Our much smaller team focuses on appellate litigation. So after there's been a back and forth and hashing out before a jury or a judge about the facts, then if the plaintiffs, the victims, are able to succeed, the defendants almost always are going to sue. But to sue, they've got to say there's some legal issue here. The judge did something wrong. And that's where we come in. We would often work in conjunction with those lawyers, arguing at the appellate level. So not so much before a jury, but before judges on matters of constitutional law or interpreting a statute or something like that.
So facts are settled, and then you guys are arguing the either problems that may have existed on the subsidiary court level or interpretations of law that were missed. Okay. Well, let's talk about what you guys are doing now. I mean, it's sort of, like you say, we're in a different era than we've seen before. Let's start first with the National Treasury Employees Union versus Russell Vogt. Russell Vogt being the OMB chair, also one of the key architects of Project 2025. He was Trump's OMB secretary in the first administration. Tell us about this suit. It's brought by a union, but it's specifically about the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau.
Right. It's about the effort by the Trump administration, which includes, on the one hand, Elon Musk and Doge, and on the other hand, Russ Vogt, who's probably the most important person in the administration, not named Elon Musk, to shut down the CFPB. So folks will remember the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau was created by Congress following the 2008 financial crash. It was the brainchild of Elizabeth Warren before she was Senator Warren, just Professor Warren back in those days. And the idea was, looking back on what had happened in the crash, there were a lot of financial regulatory agencies. Their job is basically to look at the banks and make sure the banks aren't getting too far out over their skis and being too risky. But there was no agency at the time whose primary job was to protect consumers. And consumers were the ones who were really most adversely impacted by the crash. So Congress created this agency in 2010 as part of the Dodd-Frank Act. It's been a great success. especially in the last 4 years under the Biden administration, under the leadership of Rohit Chopra, who is probably the most effective consumer champion in government in the last 50 years. It's returned more than $20 billion to consumers. It's stopped all kinds of predatory activities by payday lenders, credit card companies, big banks, student lenders, and more. It had issued recently rules to protect consumers against rip-off overdraft fees or having medical debt attached to your credit report. A lot of really, really good things that have protected consumers, which is exactly why Russ Vought and Elon Musk wanted to shut it down. Elon Musk had the extra interest of the fact that he's trying to turn Twitter X into a payment processor, which would in fact be regulated by the CFPB if he's able to do that. So he was trying to shut down the agency that would regulate his business. They were going in typical Doge fashion, just basically trying to empty the building, fire everybody, end all the contracts, and in this case, literally delete every record the agency had ever accumulated. Representing the workers at the CFPB, some consumer protection organizations, and a person who had a case that the CFPB was handling at the time, we were able to bring forward a lawsuit that has stopped them from being able to terminate the agency.
And we should just say, you mentioned the overdraft fees. The Republicans literally just voted to uncap overdraft fees and allow banks to manipulate the order of your purchases to increase the amount that you've overdrafted and charge you more fees. It's shocking that they could take this vote and, then be so proud of it, but that's what they did. So what is different about this case as opposed to like stopping what they're doing to USAID? Like, do you need to have a specific plaintiff who is specifically impacted here to bring this case, as opposed to they're doing the same thing with the USAID. They're doing the same thing with like the museums and libraries. They're doing the same thing with the International Peace Organization. I mean, there's so many different agencies, but you need to have a specific plaintiff. Is that it?
Yeah, that's right. And we've been doing the USAID case as well. So to bring these lawsuits, you can't just say, hey, what they're doing is illegal. By the way, it's always illegal. It's almost always in violation of the Constitution. To be able to bring the lawsuit, you have to say you are directly affected. That's the idea people may have heard of, that you have to have standing to bring the lawsuit. And the way the conservative courts have worked over recent decades, it's hard for consumers or the public to show standing. Corporations, by the way, almost always have standing to bring challenges to government action. They say, hey, we're directly regulated, we have standing, the courts agree. So in these cases, it's been challenging, but we were able to do it effectively in the CFPB case by having the employees, but not just the employees, also people, organizations like the National Consumer Law Center that uses the research that the CFPB produces, and a person who had a case that was being managed by the CFPB and halted because of the efforts to close the agency down. By contrast, by the way, at USAID, we represented the employees there, and then we brought Oxfam in as a plaintiff as well. But because of the employees were involved, the judge said, hey, this is not really an issue about shutting down the agency. It's really an issue about laying off all the employees. If this is an employee issue, you've got to handle it through this administrative process that the government has to deal with employment issues. So that's been a problem we've had in the AID case, but it's not been a problem in the CFPB one.
What is the case? I mean, I assume that there was I assume it's not statutory. I assume there was some type of Supreme Court case, but you point out that corporations almost have standing in every case against the government. It seems to me, as a citizen, like all of these agencies on some level exist ostensibly for my benefit.
Right.
And so if they're being undermined, it seems to me I should have standing. Why don't I? I mean, and I'm not just talking about me, obviously.
Right,
Emma,
but like the CFPB, the CFPB, for example, you said that 20 billion figure in terms of what they've returned. That's been across over 200 million Americans in terms of like how the CFPB has helped them.
And we don't know how many it's helped just by existing.
Right.
So that, people don't break the law. Like, I mean, So how is it that I don't have standing?
Well, you should. We all should. 50 years ago, we probably would have, or at least you would have, if, say, an organization like Public Citizen said, hey, we've got lots of members and they're affected, we would have had organizational standing. And that was permitted 50 years ago. But there's been a steady effort to restrict standing primarily on behalf of corporations. Again, in non-authoritarian times, that's the context we're normally talking about this in. So corporations can always challenge a regulation issued by a government agency almost without fail. And they succeeded in stopping almost every single one that the Biden administration issued. But it's generally really hard for consumers or the public to do it, not because it should be, but just because of how the law has evolved.
Is that a statute? Is that statutory?
It's not a statute. The idea of standing is a constitutional concept. And so the Supreme Court has just changed what it means to have standing.
Okay, all right. That's the Supreme Court has ruled, and they've done this in I don't know if it was Concepcion, the AT&T and Concepcion sort of added to it, but there's a whole body of law that they have basically.
It's been a steady march, for 40 or 50 years.
Closing the courtroom doors to citizens is really what they've been up to.
Right.
What is the status of this case? So at the moment, you've got a preliminary injunction against, I guess, Doge from doing what? Like, in all of these situations, it feels like, and in some instances, they've been ordered to rehire the employees, but then they sort of like, well, we're not giving you back pay. In one instance, I think it was at the USDA, if I'm not mistaken. And they just make it broadly difficult. Like this is about bailing water, essentially, isn't it?
Well, hopefully it's a little more than bailing water, but the point is right. Like even when we win in these cases, and these are all still early phases, not the earliest phase, but preliminary injunction, not a final resolution of the case. In every instance, we're seeing the administration, at best, slow walk the implementation of what a judge tells them to do. And in a lot of instances, go a lot slower than that. But in this case, we've stopped them from shutting the agency down. We've stopped them from formally firing everyone. We've stopped them from canceling all the contracts they have. They've got a lot of outside contractors who do the business of the CFPB. We've stopped them from what we think they were planning to do, which was literally hit a button and delete the entirety of the records they've created over the last dozen years of operation. So that stopped. Things have been in ferment today. But the short version of a long procedural story is that the government is trying to appeal the decision.
So, I mean, largely as a strategic matter is like one of your primary goals. And I'm looking at, a whole series of cases that you have involving the government or sort of subsidiary elements. Is it just to basically maintain the structure of these things? I mean, obviously, a Trump administration Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is not going to aggressively go after banks or fraudsters. I mean, they're just not going to the extent that there are people who are still working there who want to. The political appointees are going to be putting the kibosh on that in every way they can come up with. But this is really about, or from your perspective, maintaining the structure of these entities so that in the event there's political change, these things will still exist and don't have to be built from scratch.
Yeah, that's pretty much right. I think what we could say is, in the first Trump administration, they put someone in charge who did it at the CFPB, who was pretty hostile and didn't really want the agency to do very much. But the agency did continue. It did, for example, maintain its database where it accepts consumer complaints and sort of deals with individual consumer complaints. It did bring some actions against some really extreme fraud cases, including some that the administration now is trying to undo that were brought under the first term. So I think aspirationally, we could hope for that and try to maintain that. And that's important a little bit because even that low level of functioning is something, and it reduces some of the worst frauds and ripoffs and predation that banks and others would do. But also, even more importantly, as you say, is it keeps the structure in place so we have the agency and we can deploy it at its full power when there's a change in presidential leadership.
Is there anything that's like sort of like sending off? I mean, I was going to say, is there anything sending off alarm bells? And I would imagine that's all you hear in the office. But are there other things that you're sort of like seeing down the road that you guys have some type of, I don't know, grid in your office, like where it's like, okay, we're at DEFCON 5 now. Like this is gone completely off the rails. Is that, I mean, I imagine that's just like the Trump administration completely ignoring what a court says. It doesn't feel like that they have indicated that they're going to do that in any circumstance except for maybe on the immigration side. But even then, it sort of feels like they're coming in and they're showing up and they're hemming and hawing about it. But what in your world, what are you looking out for? Or do you see signs of encouragement, or are there things that you're worried about going forward?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. One is, they're still going to try to mow over more agencies. So we just had the carnage at the Department of Health and Human Services earlier this week, and there's still other agencies. So, we're going to try to pick up the pieces and defend some of the agencies, the sub-agencies inside Health and Human Services that have either been cut so deep that you can't really say it's there anymore, or where they're trying to close it down pretty much altogether. For example, one that's not gotten to get very much attention, the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, like the part of NIH that studies worker health and safety, they're trying to obliterate it altogether. So hopefully we can keep that part going.
Now, do you keep that together by basically saying you can't fire these employees? They're a member of a union, they're a class of employees. You can't fire them, or what? Or
it's a little bit of the employees, but it's even more that the agency is created by Congress and has an direct appropriation by Congress. You can't close an agency that Congress created without Congress doing it, and you can't refuse to spend money that Congress appropriated for a particular purpose. So I guess the next thing is there are some issues that are going to go to the Supreme Court for sure. One is the ability of the president to fire people at so-called independent agencies like the Federal Trade Commission, where they're Democratic appointee or Democratic members of the commission who are supposed to be on so long as they don't engage in some crime, period. And Trump has fired them. There's a number of those instances. That's going to get to the court very soon. And then the even bigger issue, which you're alluding to, is what happens when the president says, I'm not going to spend money that Congress appropriated? That's plainly illegal. There's a law called the Impoundment Act that prevents the president from doing that. Russ Vought, that guy we were talking about, says he thinks that law is unconstitutional. The president has this inherent authority to do whatever he wants, to not spend money. That case eventually is going to get to the Supreme Court, and it will be a really big deal.
Would they have to overturn Train v. NYC to find the Impoundment Control Act unconstitutional?
They're going to find the law unconstitutional. So all the subsequent case law around it would go. But yeah, the law, they're going to say the law itself is a violation of the president's inherent power under Article 2. That's their theory. It's a very kingly theory for what the president should be.
Are you guys and are they trying to figure out which case you want to bring to the Supreme Court where that fight happens, right? I mean, I imagine we have an Impoundment Control Act implication for half a dozen, maybe more agencies. Do you as lawyers sit there and go, this is the agency and this is the circumstance, this is the case we want to get to the Supreme Court because this one gives us the best argument under that law?
You try to think about it. You don't really have control necessarily. And also, a lot of this depends on timing. Like, does it feel like it's really ripe? So they've got a year to spend, an appropriations fiscal year to spend the money. If they say they don't announce, but they just close down an agency at the beginning of the year. Well, they could still spend the money. If you say they're not spending the money, they'd say, yeah, we're going to do it later on. So there's some timing things, some issues around different agencies.
And they can't shift it. And there's already been a case under the first Trump administration where they shift that money maybe to, build the wall or something. But I would imagine it's a much harder argument to take money from OSHA and build the wall than it is from the Pentagon and build the wall.
Right.
There are a lot of overlapping factors when you have complete disregard for the law as they do. So it's exactly what you said. Another thing that came up in that case and will come up again is, well, what if they declare a national emergency? of whatever kind. He's declared a lot of national emergencies so far. So the president has a lot of emergency powers. Is there some constraint on deciding when there's an emergency? How does the emergency thing overlap with the impoundment? So the case may not be completely clean.
That's what's happening with the Alien Enemies Act right now, too. Does he have the power to invoke that just willy-nilly?
Exactly. It's actually relates to the tariff authority. That's an emergency. He's declared major national a series of instances around energy issues. So a lot of the stuff to sort of drill, baby, drill is under the guise of there's a national energy emergency. By the way, the National Energy Emergency Executive Order says we need a lot more energy, and it defines energy to exclude solar and wind. Everything else is energy, but not solar and wind.
So it's really a national energy-ish emergency.
Right.
A national big oil emergency.
Lastly, the budget resolution that, I should say the continuing resolution, it's really not really a continuing resolution, but ostensibly, that was just passed a week and a half ago. Did that implicate the administration's ability to take money that it had saved by firing, let's say, half the employees at HHS or whatever percentage it is, and use it somewhere else? Like, did that budget bill in any way implicate what you're dealing with here, particularly in terms of the impoundment?
Yeah, we think the opposite. So now the government has, the money was running out of time. Now there's more money to spend for the rest of the fiscal year. With some exceptions around the margins, what the continuing resolution did is say, it's what it sounds like. It's continuing what we did before. It's same as it was, and then some marginal things. So they have a duty, an ongoing duty to spend money. So they say we're closing AID, but the continuing resolution has more money for USAID. They can say they want to close the CFPB is a little different appropriation-wise, but these agencies are trying to close the Department of Health and Human Services, for example. Money was just appropriated for those entities. So we think that makes the case stronger for us.
I'm glad to hear that. Robert Weissman, co-president of the nonprofit advocacy organization Public Citizen, thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it. When will we hear more about what's happening? I mean, do you know with the CFPB? Like, it's a preliminary injunction. What's the next step on that?
Well, they're appealing, actually today, and asking the appeals court to overturn the preliminary injunction. I think the appeals court's going to decline to do that. We want a really good decision in that case. The judge gave a 112-page decision, was very specific about why the government was operating improperly. When they said, we're not really closing it down, she went through a lot of detail about how they were. When they said, we'll at least maintain what the law requires us to do, she cited them saying, well, we can't actually tell you what our statutory duties are. It was also a pretty spicy decision. So we really were happy with that. But it's a strong decision. It'll be hard to overturn that one.
The first line of the memorandum opinion is CFPB RIP. Elon Musk said that back in February. That sort of, I would imagine, is a little bit damning as to what they see they're doing. Again, Robert Weissman, thanks so much for your work. I really appreciate it, and thanks for coming on.
Great to be with you. Thanks so much.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.